I have a long resume here.
Well,
It's a very long one. Do you want to introduce yourself?
sure, why not? That will make it brief this time, I think. So my name's George Carroll. I'm a retired professor at the University of Oregon. And I've been a mycologist for over 40 years. And, you know, that's been my passion as a biologist. But I came to the world of molds actually relatively recently. About 5 years ago, I became chief scientist of a very small consulting firm who would look at samples that were sent to us largely by building inspectors, or more frequently by specialized mold inspectors, and sometimes, and later also homeowners. And we would look at them, tell them what in fact was present in the house in terms of species composition and numbers, and make some estimates about what the level of risk or concern ought to be. And I'm not talking to a group of building inspectors and mold inspectors today. If you're interested, I think in the back there are some sample reports that my small consulting firm, Moldworks, issued. If you want to see an example of what I think a mold report should look like, you're welcome to look that over, but I don't expect it will be so much interest to you folks today, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Now, I want to say that this presentation was devised for a group of mold inspectors. And when I was asked to do this, I went to my computer and looked up the PowerPoint presentation and found, of course, that technology had moved on and that this presentation was now no longer editable but was read-only. So there are things in here that I won't talk about today, and I think it will leave room for questions, which I think is perhaps of much more use. Well, I always like to start out by asking people, or telling people, explaining a bit, what are molds and where do they come from? Well, molds are a sort of loose subgroup of the kingdom of fungi, which probably comprise at least 2 million species of organisms, most of which have not yet been described. They're ancient. They're not plants, they're not animals, they're in their own kingdom, and they've probably been around as, at least in terrestrial environments, as a separate group of organisms for 500 million years. So I say this just to point out that molds have been here longer than human beings, and their presence in houses is purely an accidental sort of thing. They in no way particularly evolved to infect houses. It's just that some of them happen to be good at living in the kinds of habitats that houses present. So how would you recognize a mold? Well, of course, in biology, as with many places, there are exceptions to every rule. But in general, molds are filamentous. They make thread-like cells, which are very good at invading things, particularly porous substrates like drywall or insulated tiles, things like that. They can get in there, and then once they're in there to stay. You're not going to get them out or remove them. You might seal them over, you might tear the drywall out, but basically you're not going to be pulling those fungal threads out of the substrate in which they're living. These are not bacteria. Bacteria are another major group of microorganisms. The fungi are actually much more advanced. They have cell walls, which makes them tough. And in terms of getting rid of them, that's probably something you ought to know. It's not a simple thing to get rid of molds. Molds and fungi are not photosynthetic. They can't make their own food. They have to get it from somewhere else. And in the context of molds living in houses, that somewhere else is often, not always, but often, the cellulose in the paper that covers drywalls. It may be, other more or less easy to break down materials, but very frequently that in fact is where what the molds are living in. They exhibit invasive growth. Well, you may have already gathered that. They tell you they can penetrate drywall. That tells you that they can invade all sorts of even inorganic substrates. How do they get their food? They get it by carrying out rot. So the fungi are called ingest dirty rotters. And they do this by secreting digestive enzymes, which then move out into the environment and break down things like cellulose. And then as the mold grows along, it absorbs back the smaller pieces of what these digestive enzymes have produced. And finally, and very importantly for the mold question, most fungi produce spores, often several different kinds of spores, both sexual and asexual. And when they're asexual spores, there may in fact be several sizes and shapes. And in fact, it's the spores which are largely responsible for the difficulty that we're talking about. Okay, well, let's move on here. Well, we mentioned invasive growth. So there's an example of a mold or a fungus growing on an agar petri plate with a translucent medium in it. You can see it was inoculated right at the beginning there. And all of these thread-like filamentous cells have grown out. And if you turn the book over, because this was in the front of the mycology text printed in Denmark, you see the tips of the growing threads, and that's sort of the business end of these fungal cells, where the actual enzyme secretion and invasion and growth takes place. Okay, well, that's a little bit about what molds are. These are the organisms we're dealing with when we talk about molds. So the next question is, who cares whether you have molds in your house? Why the concern? Well, first of all, they're aesthetic concerns. You know, it looks bad to have a nice white wall with black streaks and blotches on it. And the serious mold infections often have horrible smells. And that's also an aesthetic concern. That is not really the principal concern. That's not why you're all here this morning, because molds smell bad. There's a subgroup of molds which in fact are capable of rotting wood. These are colloquially called timber rots. If you have timber rots in your house, that can be in fact a very serious situation. But in fact, that's not the situation which mold inspectors normally look for. You know, if you have a serious case of timber rot, then you have a very bad situation indeed, and you know, often they're specialized people, very expensive specialized people actually. You may have to get out to look at the situation to tell you what to do. But these are not generally the purview of the mold inspector either. That's something they would note, but they wouldn't say, you know, they wouldn't provide much advice on what to do about it. Okay, so let's look at things that molds really are involved with. Certainly one of the major problems is that they are allergenic. They produce compounds which are cause of allergies in human beings, well indeed in other animals too. And these allergens are mostly borne in the surfaces of spores. Okay, so this, as we go along, you'll really get the message that, in fact, the spores are the real issue here. If the fungi didn't produce spores, then we wouldn't be having all of these problems. Some molds, not all, but some molds produce mycotoxins. These are substances that are produced by fungi. And I'll say more about them later. They can be very dire indeed, or they can be of really little significance in the mold question. A few molds are actually pathogens in humans, and I'll talk about those in a second, but that is another category of concern. Finally, not on this chart, but I think for people in this room, if you're a property owner, you ought to be really concerned to know whether you have mold in your house, because molds are almost invariably a signal of water intrusion. If you have molds, most molds at least, you can be quite sure that there's been water intrusion that preceded the growth of those molds on these construction materials. One caveat: if you happen to be living in Florida or South Carolina or someplace like that, there is a select group of molds which are extremely drought tolerant, and in fact can grow on walls under conditions of very, very high humidity without active water intrusion. We don't see those.